Welcome to True Crime Files. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and in today's episode, we're diving into one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history, one that terrorized an entire city, confounded investigators, and left behind more questions than answers. A string of brutal murders, each victim strangled in their own home, no signs of forced entry, and a chilling sense that the killer could be anyone. A neighbor, a delivery man, or even someone they trusted. Tonight, we uncover the mystery of the Boston Strangler. Stay tuned. Albert DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, into a life defined by hardship and violence. The son of a physically abusive father, DeSalvo grew up in an unstable household where cruelty was commonplace. His father, notorious for his violent outbursts, would reportedly beat his wife and children without hesitation, at times even breaking his mother's fingers in moments of rage. It was an environment that bred both fear and detachment, shaping DeSalvo's early understanding of control, power, and aggression. As a child, DeSalvo exhibited behaviors that hinted at a troubled mind. He was known to torture animals, an early warning sign often associated with psychopathy. His first run-ins with the law began in adolescence, leading to a string of petty crimes, including breaking and entering. By his teenage years, he had already spent time in juvenile detention centers, places where he learned to refine his ability to manipulate and deceive. Despite his troubled past, DeSalvo managed to enlist in the U.S. Army, serving for several years and even earning an honorable discharge. During his time in the military, he married a German woman and later started a family, outwardly appearing to live a normal life. But beneath that facade, darker impulses lurked. DeSalvo's interactions with women grew increasingly concerning, evolving from inappropriate behavior to outright criminal acts. The late 1950s and early 1960s saw Boston undergoing significant change. The post-war boom had transformed the city into a growing metropolitan hub, but beneath the surface, a deep unease spread. The civil rights movement was reshaping societal structures, and shifting gender roles left many traditionalists unsettled. Against this backdrop of change and uncertainty, women in Boston found themselves living in a heightened state of fear. The crimes attributed to the Boston Strangler began in 1962, at a time when women were gaining independence but still faced deeply ingrained societal vulnerabilities. Many of the victims were older women, living alone, perhaps seen as easy targets. At a time when trust in authority was paramount and leaving doors unlocked was not unusual, the idea of a predator moving through the city undetected sent shockwaves through the community. While DeSalvo had yet to be linked to the crimes, his criminal behavior was escalating. He had already been dubbed the Measuring Man after being arrested for posing as a talent scout and convincing women to let him take their measurements for supposed modeling opportunities. Later, he would become known as the Green Man, due to his habit of breaking into apartments while dressed in green work clothes, assaulting women but leaving no evidence behind. The Boston Strangler's reign of terror began amid this era of social transition, striking fear into a city that was beginning to question just how safe its streets and its own homes really were. Women who had once felt secure in their routines were now double-checking locks, avoiding strangers, and wondering if the man who offered a friendly smile might be hiding something far more sinister. It began on June 14, 1962. The body of 55-year-old Anna Slessors was discovered in her apartment on Gainsborough Street in Boston. She had been strangled with the belt from her bathrobe, left tied around her neck in a gruesome bow. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. The police initially believed it to be a botched burglary, but something about the crime scene felt different, almost ritualistic. Over the next few weeks, the killings continued. Less than 2 weeks later, on June 28th, 68-year-old Nina Nichols was found murdered in her home in Newton, a suburb of Boston. Like Slessors, she had been strangled with her own stockings, her body left posed in a disturbingly deliberate manner. That same day, another woman, 65-year-old Helen Blake, was found dead in her Lynn apartment. She too had been strangled, her stockings knotted around her throat. The similarities were chilling. All of the victims were older women. All were found inside their homes, and in each case there were no signs of forced entry. The killer had either been let in willingly or had found a way to gain entry without attracting attention. Panic began to spread across the city as the pattern became impossible to ignore. By mid-July, the death toll had climbed. The body of 75-year-old Ida Erger was found on July 19th, her murder bearing the same hallmarks as the previous attacks. Days later, 67-year-old Jane Sullivan was found strangled in her bathtub. The police, initially hesitant to suggest a serial killer was at work, could no longer deny the horrifying reality. Someone was systematically targeting Boston's women. The public response was immediate. The city, once considered relatively safe, was gripped by fear. Women who had once left their doors unlocked began installing new locks, reinforcing windows and refusing to answer the door for strangers. News headlines dubbed the unknown assailant the Mad Strangler, and a sense of paranoia crept into the daily lives of Boston's residents. Authorities were desperate to catch the killer, but they were at a loss. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no clear motive. The victims did not seem to have any connection to each other. They came from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, and different walks of life. The only thing they shared was their gender, their vulnerability, and the way in which they had been killed. The investigation intensified as detectives combed through records, interviewed potential suspects, and tried to construct a profile of the murderer. But just as they were beginning to understand his pattern, the killer changed his approach. The next victim would break the mold, leaving investigators with more questions than answers, and pushing the city further into a state of terror. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together any shred of evidence that could lead them to the elusive killer. The methodical nature of the crimes suggested a perpetrator who was careful, calculating. With no signs of forced entry, investigators believed the women had willingly let him inside. Perhaps he had posed as a maintenance worker, a delivery man, or even someone they already knew. Law enforcement formed a special task force, combing through thousands of records and interviewing anyone who might have been in the vicinity of the crime scenes. Door-to-door questioning became routine. The Boston police sought help from the FBI, hoping a psychological profile could narrow their suspect list. The early theories painted a picture of a man who likely harbored deep-seated hatred toward women, someone who was either charming enough to gain their trust or skilled enough to avoid leaving any forensic evidence behind. Tips flooded in, but most led nowhere. Then a break in the case. A witness claimed to have seen a strange man loitering near one of the victim's buildings, but the description was vague. Dark hair, medium build, well-dressed. It was hardly enough to pinpoint a suspect. The first major lead came when police arrested a man named Charles Terry, a known sexual predator who had previously strangled a woman in a manner similar to the Strangler's crimes. His history of violence raised suspicion, but as investigators probed further, inconsistencies emerged. His whereabouts didn't align with every attack. Though he remained on the police radar, they needed something stronger. The investigation took another turn when authorities looked into career criminals with histories of breaking into homes. One name stood out: Albert DeSalvo. He had been arrested for a series of sexual assaults in which he would talk his way into women's apartments by pretending to be a modeling scout or a maintenance worker. He would then tie them up, assault them, and leave. Though he hadn't killed his victims, the way he manipulated his way inside their homes bore a disturbing resemblance to how the Strangler might have operated. But DeSalvo was in custody by the time the last of the Strangler murders had been committed, creating a perplexing problem. Was the Boston Strangler one man, or were there multiple killers operating under the same moniker? The inconsistencies in the timeline, combined with different methods used in some of the later crimes, led to growing skepticism within law enforcement. Some detectives believed a single killer was responsible, while others theorized that copycats or an entirely different murderer could have taken over. Despite the mounting pressure to close the case, investigators struggled to find definitive proof that would lead to an arrest. The fear in Boston remained palpable, and the city was desperate for answers. But before police could confidently declare that they had caught their man, DeSalvo himself would change the course of the investigation by coming forward with a confession that would shock both law enforcement and the public alike. Albert DeSalvo's confession gave investigators and psychologists their first real opportunity to peer into the mind of the Boston Strangler. But what they found was as disturbing as it was perplexing. DeSalvo spoke of his crimes with an unsettling level of detail, describing each victim, their apartments, and the way he had gained entry. Yet despite his claims, there was no physical evidence linking him to the murders. No fingerprints, no DNA, no definitive proof beyond his own words. What drove someone to commit such crimes? Profilers attempting to understand the psychology of the Strangler theorized that the killer harbored deep-seated resentment toward women. His choice of victims, mostly older, single women, suggested a possible connection to maternal or authority figures in his life. The method of strangulation was deeply personal, an act that required physical closeness, control, and a desire to watch his victims die. This level of brutality pointed to a sadistic compulsion, one that could have stemmed from childhood trauma, rejection, or an unstable upbringing. DeSalvo's own background offered possible insights. Raised in a chaotic household with an abusive father, his early life was marred by violence and instability. He had a history of petty crime and sexual offences long before the Strangler murders began. His compulsive need to manipulate women, convincing them to let him inside their homes under false pretenses, hinted at a psychological thrill that extended beyond just the act of killing. Some experts believed that the Strangler wasn't just seeking dominance over his victims, but also validation, proving to himself that he could outsmart both his targets and law enforcement. Yet, questions remained. Could one man be responsible for all the murders? Some experts noted inconsistencies in the crimes, slightly different methods, varying levels of brutality, and even differing victim profiles. This led to speculation that the Boston Strangler might not have been a single individual, but rather multiple killers operating in the same city. If true, DeSalvo may have confessed to crimes he didn't commit, either for notoriety or as a way to escape harsher punishment for other offences. Another psychological angle considered was DeSalvo's own mental state. Some believed he suffered from a personality disorder, possibly psychopathy or dissociative identity disorder, which could explain his ability to recall details of crimes while maintaining a seemingly normal demeanour in daily life. His calm, almost boastful confessions contradicted the typical remorse seen in some serial offenders, further deepening the mystery of his true nature. Regardless of the psychological theories, the question of motive remained difficult to pin down. Was the Boston Strangler driven by an internal rage against women, an insatiable need for power, or something even more complex, an urge to control not just his victims, but the entire narrative of his crimes? The mind of a serial killer is rarely easy to decode, and in the case of the Boston Strangler, even the most experienced profilers were left with more questions than answers. But as the case progressed, the focus shifted to whether DeSalvo's confession would hold up, and if justice had truly been served. Despite Albert DeSalvo's detailed confession, the case against him was never airtight. Without physical evidence linking him to the crimes, prosecutors couldn't charge him with the Boston Strangler murders directly. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison for a series of unrelated sexual assaults, part of the so-called Green Man crimes. For years, his confession was the closest thing to a resolution the public had, though many remained unconvinced that justice had truly been served. Then, in 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his prison cell under mysterious circumstances. Official reports suggested that his killing was the result of a dispute with fellow inmates, though some theorized that he had been silenced to prevent him from retracting his confession. His death only added to the uncertainty surrounding the case. With DeSalvo gone, no one could press him further, and many wondered, was the Boston Strangler still out there? For decades, the case remained in a state of limbo, technically closed, yet riddled with doubt. It wasn't until 2013 that the most significant breakthrough occurred. Advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the final Strangler victim, Mary Sullivan, who had been raped and murdered in 1964. A single piece of DNA, left on a blanket found at the crime scene, was tested against DeSalvo's relatives, and the results came back as a near-perfect match. It was the first and only piece of physical evidence ever linking him to the crimes. With this discovery, law enforcement formally declared that DeSalvo was responsible for at least one of the Boston Strangler murders. But for many, the DNA match did little to answer the bigger question: did he act alone? Or had the Boston Strangler been a collection of different killers whose crimes were all attributed to one name? Some experts pointed out inconsistencies between DeSalvo's confession and the actual crime scenes. He had provided incorrect details about certain victims, and the methods of strangulation varied between cases. Additionally, not all of the murders involved sexual assault, a deviation that suggested different motivations or different perpetrators. This led some to believe that DeSalvo was responsible for some of the killings, but not all. Others argued that DeSalvo had been a pathological liar, someone eager to take credit for crimes he hadn't committed in a desperate bid for infamy. If true, then the real Boston Strangler, or Stranglers, had never been caught at all. Even with the DNA evidence, uncertainty lingers. To this day, some families of the victims remain skeptical, unwilling to fully accept DeSalvo as the sole perpetrator. And with the passage of time, the likelihood of uncovering further answers grows ever slimmer. The case of the Boston Strangler is often considered closed, but in the minds of many, it remains an unsettling mystery. Whether DeSalvo was the lone killer or simply the most convenient suspect, one truth is undeniable: his crimes, or those of whoever was truly responsible, left an indelible scar on the city of Boston. The terror that gripped Boston in the early 1960s may have faded with time, but the spectre of the Boston Strangler still lingers in the city's history. The case, officially closed yet endlessly debated, represents more than just a string of brutal murders. It embodies the fear, uncertainty, and flaws within the justice system that left room for doubt even after a confession and a conviction. The crimes exposed the vulnerabilities of a city that, until then, had not known such fear. Women were no longer safe in their own homes, and trust in the ability of law enforcement to protect them began to erode. The murders forced Bostonians to change the way they lived. Doors were locked, neighbors were eyed with suspicion, and the streets grew quieter as fear took hold. Albert DeSalvo's confession provided an answer, but for many it was never the right answer. Though he described the crimes in vivid detail, discrepancies in his statements cast doubt on his role in every killing. His mysterious prison murder only deepened suspicions, leaving behind a tangle of unresolved questions. The 2013 DNA breakthrough offered the first real physical link between DeSalvo and one of the victims. For some, this was enough to confirm his guilt. For others, it only reinforced the idea that he may have been responsible for a portion of the murders, while the rest remained the work of an unknown killer, or killers. The inconsistencies in method, motive, and even physical descriptions of the suspect only add to the uncertainty, fueling theories that the Boston Strangler was not one man, but multiple predators taking advantage of a city in fear. The debate surrounding the case speaks to something larger: our need for certainty, for closure. Serial crimes leave wounds that stretch beyond the victims, affecting families, communities, and the way we perceive safety itself. When a case is left open-ended, it becomes something more than just history. It becomes folklore, a legend that continues to haunt long after the murders have stopped. And perhaps that is why the story of the Boston Strangler remains so compelling. It is not just about the horror of what happened, but about the lingering unknowns. The possibility that justice was never truly served. The fear that somewhere, hidden in the past, lies the truth we will never fully uncover. Whether Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, one of many, or simply a man who took credit for crimes he did not commit, the legacy of those murders still echoes. The women who lost their lives are more than just victims of an infamous crime spree. They are a reminder of how fragile security can be, and how, even decades later, some mysteries refuse to be buried. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and this has been another episode of True Crime Files. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and share the show with your fellow true crime enthusiasts. I'll be back next time to uncover more chilling mysteries. Until then, stay safe out there. If you enjoyed this episode and want to dive deeper into the world of true crime, consider subscribing for exclusive access to content you won't find anywhere else. As a subscriber, you'll get banned episodes, episodes too shocking or controversial for mainstream platforms, members-only bonus episodes, not available anywhere else, extended director's cut versions of your favorite cases, early access to new episodes before they're released to the public, and much more. Thank you for your support. The link is in the description below. Join now.